those of them that have been able to get on Blackboard, because that's a whole separate mess too. Students that need to be online, not able to do that at all. That has been a nightmare. Try that again. Why isn't it working? Hold on just a second. Channel. Okay, there it is. Why can I see it on my studio? There we go. Now, is it working? There we go. All is well. Alright. Oh, yeah, let's not do that. Let's just do... this. Yeah, get in there without it turning off. Alright. So, this is where we ended last. The attempt to remain neutral in the First World War. Well, before even that, we had Wilson dealing with the issues down in Mexico, which again, like, wasn't our problem, but there was all that big stick diplomacy happening at the time, so the idea of Mexico having a leader we didn't want was our problem. We should go in there and make a point of it. Didn't go the way we wanted it to go. And then while all this was happening, you know, we had all of the Great War starting in Europe. But most Americans didn't want to be involved. There were many peace activists wanted to keep America neutral, which, you know, again, Wilson was like a main proponent of that too. But everyone, well, I shouldn't say everyone, but most Americans, even the peace activists, didn't want Germany to win. You know, they weren't like, oh, well, you know, whatever happens, happens. It was like, hey, you know, Germany needs to lose and Britain needs to win. Like, it needs to very specifically go one way, but also we don't want to be involved. So it wasn't really true neutrality. Anyway, there's Mexican Revolution again. I do like the note over there in the book. Mexican dishes must be highly seasoned. Nice little joke there. There's again the where do we go? There's the Via and Pershing here. And I had to go through these quickly since the class was ending last time, but here we have Wilson steering us clear of the rocks. You've got war on one side, intervention on the other, which is kind of the same thing. I mean, getting involved in a war is being in a war. But there you have the lighthouse of justice steering us clear of both. Wilson at the helm. You know, not being involved is totally the same. Although we very much were involved to a degree, which we'll get to in a minute. And like Wilson's main thing, as we're going to see here in just a little bit, was keeping us out of the war. And in 1916, when he ran for re-election, that was what he was running on, was, hey, I kept us out of the war, don't you want to keep that going? And here we have, you know, vote for Wilson, who kept you out of the war. And then, you know, there's this supposed information being sent that there were U-boats in New York Harbor, which, again, never actually really happened. but it was this idea of how well would Wilson's "we kept you out of war" policy go if there was hostile action against the U.S.? So, a lot of this, war in Europe, peace in America, a lot of peace activists. And this was the, what do we have here? The Women's Peace Party, led by Jane Addams and Carrie Chapman Catt. Again, Jane Addams was involved in a lot more than just the Hull House. And then the last one here, Real Patriots Keep Cool. Don't, just because there's a war happening doesn't mean we need to be involved. However, we know in hindsight that we did eventually become involved in the First World War, but there were gradual steps to this. So there were two problems that faced U.S. remaining neutral. One, we were much closer economically with the Allies than we were with the Central Powers. We had purchased $750 million, the Allies purchased $750 million in American goods over the course of, just in 1914, which increased by a factor of 4. While the Germans bought $350 million, which shrunk to $30 million by 1917. Now, this doesn't mean that they were buying less. We were simply selling them less. We also were issuing the Allies loans, which in 1914, Wilson said that giving warring powers loans, quote, was against the spirit of true neutrality, but by 1915 he allowed these loans. By 1917, the Allies had $2.2 billion in loans, while the Germans were given about $27 million. And I know $27 million seems like that's a lot, but when you're fighting a world war, especially in Germany, on two fronts, that isn't a lot, not compared to $2.2 billion. Now, I know technically the Central Powers are more than Germany, but when it's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, I guess technically Italy was there for a little while, but then they switched sides. It was mostly Germany. Austria-Hungary was there, but they were already fragmenting, and the Ottoman Empire was on its way out anyway, so it was mostly Germany. There was also the issue in how the British and the Germans conducted war. So, considering Britain essentially controlled the ocean, they blockaded the heck out of Germany because they could. That's how they rolled. It wasn't unlike how the British fought the French in the Napoleonic Wars. They blockaded the heck out of, not just France, but like most of Europe. So the blockade was to starve out the Germans. And not just like literally starve them out, but to deny them resources to continue the war. So technically, since the U.S. was neutral, we could, by wartime law, send ships through the blockade to Germany to bring them non-military supplies. However, the British blockade still stopped U.S. ships, and Wilson just let it happen. He's like, the British we're technically for the British, so we'll just let it happen. Germany, in order to fight the British, because Germany had one naval engagement with the British, the Battle of Jutland, which is considered both like a major triumph for the Germans and a major, not really defeat, because it was a neutral, not a neutral, it was a draw. The Battle of Jutland, there was not a victory for either side. it was seen as a victory for Germany because it was like the first real engagement their Navy had, and they weren't defeated by the British Navy, which was, the Navy in the biggest Navy in the world. But it was seen as like a huge blunder for the British because they didn't crush the German Navy in this massive battle, and made the British realize that they hadn't actually updated their Navy in like 100 years. But other than the Battle of Jutland, the Germans really didn't have much of a navy to speak of, so they developed the U-boat, or Unterseeboot, to break this blockade. Obviously, these little submarines could not do the old maritime law practice of telling ships, hey, we're about to fire on you, you might want to get your civilians off, because that kind of ruins the point of a submarine. Because a lot of these ships, as we're going to see in a little bit, despite often appearing to be harmless passenger ships, had guns on them and would shoot back. And again, the point of a submarine is to not get shot at. Big battleships and stuff had armor, and like they could handle a couple of shots and then could shoot back. A submarine, if you so much as shoot near them, they'll break. In fact, a lot of U-boats sunk just because they weren't well put together. So if you're going to try and shoot at a ship in a U-boat, you do not want to be seen at all. So they'd have to open fire on these ships without any kind of warning. One ship sunk by a U-boat was the Lusitania, sunk on May 15th, 1915, killing about 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Apparently this, 1/10 of the total casualties was enough to have a lot of Americans calling for military action, including Roosevelt, because of course he's still around and he's still, rattling his saber. But this was, right at the election, and Wilson managed to stick to his peacetime strategy and managed to win the 1916 election, but only after demanding the Germans accept strict accountability for the action and pay a settlement to the survivors. I will discuss the Lusitania a bit more here in just a moment. The Lusitania is often cited as being one of the major reasons we went to war. It was a reason that we were pushed towards war, but it's not like how World War I began, where it's 100% definitely the spark was Archduke Ferdinand getting shot, but there was a lot that led up to that. The reason we get involved is there's a lot that leads up to it, and then there's no real spark. There's just a lot of stuff that happens, and then we finally were just we gotta just get involved now. We've got too much. We're already involved essentially. We just need to go ahead and go to war. So here's the blockades. You've got the close blockade here to keep the Germans bottled up. This is where their main ports were. Obviously Jutland here off the coast of Denmark is where the big battle was. They've got this bigger blockade here for any that slip out, and then this far blockade to try to keep any U-boats from getting out into open ocean. Oops. And here we have the remainder of the German fleet following the war. Well, some of the German, you actually have the German fleet here with the British fleet flanking them. I mean, a lot of ships either way. And here's the U-boat here. You see they sat real low in the water. But the way U-boats were designed, I mean, the reason they were called, undersea boats and not like submarines is they were designed like boats. I mean, you can see the shape. It's not shaped round like modern day submarines. It does still have that sort of flat top. And I mean, because the way they would surface, there was still like a lot they could do on the surface. I mean, they had like anti-aircraft guns, or flak guns, I guess you'd say. A lot of times they would even have like guns they could use against the ships in addition to the torpedo bays. And I had a friend who, well, I mean, a guy I worked with, who was in the Navy, and he, I mean, he technically worked or was stationed on the sub, but he always called it the boat because it was also small. And the way he put it, when they surfaced, it was like being in a raft. Like it got knocked around by the waves real bad. He said it wasn't a proper submarine, not one of those real big ones like you think of when you think of submarines. It was very, very small. So he's always been interested in U-boats because it's more like what he was stationed in. So here's another one here. Yeah, this one's got one of the bigger cannons on the front for dealing with, I guess, probably smaller attack boats rather than like actually shooting at a ship. Because if you're shooting at a ship, you're in the wrong place. There's, assume that's the Lusitania going down. There's some at dry dock. They're way up out of the water here. Oh, yes, here we go. I dare you to come out. The Kaiser defies American rights, national honor, freedom of the seas, and international law. Yeah, you know, because you can't really do normal ship combat with a U-boat. There was also a number of Irish that died on the Lusitania, and so there was a push for the Irish to join the war because the Irish also weren't involved due to, during the First World War, there was a big push for Ireland to break away from Britain, and the idea of going to war on the side of the British was seen as just repugnant, and even this was just seen as just not enough to try to go to war because they refused to go to fight on the side of the British. And there was eventually like this push that, well, if you fight in this war with us, because the British were getting desperate, if you fight in this war with us, we'll give you independence. And a number of Irish did sign up, and then World War I ended, and the British, of course, didn't give Ireland independence, so the Irish went to war with the British, and it was bad. Like the British shelled Dublin, and that's a whole separate thing. It was not great. So we have a lot of, propaganda about this thing. Take up the sword of justice, all these people drowning. Here's an actual, I did a lot of research when I was up in Rhode Island at grad school. And some of the most interesting stuff was just going back and finding newspaper clippings of the day. I did a big paper on, well, I mean, just like airships in general. So I found like the London Times and was like getting newspaper clippings of the Blitz during World War II. And it was really neat to like actually see London newspapers during the time when London was being bombed. So actually being able to see newspaper clippings of these events as they happened, because like here they say probably 1,260 dead. They're a little bit off of the number that we have today, but pretty close. I mean, considering like it had just happened, and so there's a few people missing that they found later. Twice torpedoed, 6 to 15 minutes. Turner safe, Rothman and Vanderbilt missing. Believes a grave crisis is at hand, because there's this concern that this might lead to war. This is actually when we got involved in the war. Every Liberty Bond is a shot at a U-boat. We'll get into Liberty Bonds in a little bit. Okay, so, real quick, before I go to the next slide, or not to the next image, why do you guys think the Germans would bother shooting at passenger ships? I mean, it's not that they were misidentifying them. They knew. I mean, you can tell, like, from a distance, the silhouette of a passenger ship versus a battleship. No. Because it's gonna cause more issues than anything else. Because when you've got a ship the size of the Lusitania, oops, okay, come on now. When you've got a ship the size of the Lusitania, sure, you can fit a lot of people on it. And I mean, they're civilians, so they're not really important in the war effort. But there's a lot of stuff you can put down here. And not just like, food and medicine and civilian supplies, but like guns and ammo and explosives and military supplies. And the British did that a lot. The British would well, I shouldn't say always. They would very often fill passenger ships with military supplies. Obviously undeclared. And claim that, these are passenger ships. They're innocent civilian ships that we're sending across the ocean. They just so happen to be full of military equipment. And not only that, but they would fly an American flag, which would imply that it's a neutral ship that Germany would presumably leave alone. However, the Germans weren't dumb, and they knew what was going on. And so they saw these ships and knew that they were coming from British harbors, and they knew that they were loaded with military goods, and they were. The Lusitania was full of small arms and ammunition and, military goods. It wasn't just people. I mean, it had people in it, obviously. Lots of people died, but they were on top of essentially a military convoy. So, yeah. It says here, John Bull uses the American flag for protection. So you've got here, can't you see him, a bloomin' Yankee? So, we managed to not go to war over the Lusitania. Now, again, the whole, the Lusitania was actually carrying military supplies thing. Didn't come out until later because, of course, the British weren't going to let everybody know that, and nobody was going to listen to the Germans. So, that didn't come out until later. January 22nd, 1917, Wilson said that the world needed peace without victory. Basically, the war just needed to end. We couldn't just have one side crush the other because neither side were willing to back down. They just both needed to be willing for the war to stop because neither side were willing to just surrender. In 1915 and 1916, Germany pledged not to use the U-boat to keep the U.S. out of the war, but by 1917, the war was getting more desperate, so Germany once again began using unrestricted U-boat warfare, which meant that it was not simply sinking military ships, but civilian passenger ships, which again were very often full of military supplies. They weren't just sinking passenger ships for the hell of it. Not that I'm trying to be like pro-German Empire here, but World War I is not like World War II, where the Germany is 100% the bad guy in this situation. Germany was, just as much an aggressor as Britain and France, and America not so much. America, we got involved later, but like Britain and France wanted to go to war as much as Germany and Austria-Hungary did. Britain turned over the Zimmermann telegram on February 24th, 1917. This was from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann. Basically, it said that Germany would ally with Mexico if the U.S. joined the Allies, and if the Central Powers won, then Mexico will be given Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, because, hey, if we win, we'll just take land from the U.S., because presumably we'd just be able to do that. Obviously, public opinion very quickly turned against the Central Powers and were angry and wanted to go to war. Now, also, public opinion was against Mexico because of that whole, almost war we had gone to up to this point. Due to, not Pershing. Pershing was the guy we sent over. Villa. So in February and March, German U-boats sank several more armed American merchant ships, which is to say they weren't just like passenger ships that were strolling through the area. They had guns, and they were able to defend themselves. So the U-boats that were firing on them without declaring themselves were doing so to not get sunk. But this was enough that Wilson finally got Congress to declare war on the Central Powers. It took a number of days of debate, but finally the war resolution was declared. However, America refused to enter into these entangling alliances, so technically they didn't join the Allies. They instead insisted on being an associated power, which is sort of technically what Britain did, but again, this isn't a Western Europe course, so you don't need to know that, but technically only France and Russia were bound together in an alliance. Britain was only involved because of Belgium, and then America was involved because of all this other stuff as a separate power. We were more against Germany than we were with everybody else. Essentially, the reason we did this was so that whatever treaties were signed, we wouldn't be immediately bound by, because we didn't want to be involved in future conflicts in Europe if we could help it. Because that won't ever happen. Still, though, it took a while for us to muster troops and prepare arms for the conflict. So the first thing we really did was send ships over to Europe to help the British in dealing with U-boats. Unfortunately, there was also the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that caused Russia to pull out of the war entirely, that allowed for Germany to, pull forces from the Eastern Front and focus on the West, which caused the war to last longer than it would have. Still, though, after a 2-month battle in Argonne Forest, the remaining Allies broke through towards Germany, which surrendered on November 11, 1918. There's a lot more to the war, obviously, but for the sake of America, we aren't super involved in things. The stuff we're really doing is as we're going to see here in a little bit, is more stuff going on at home with how the government's being involved, and also Wilson's 14 points in the League of Nations and whatnot. If you want to know more about the war specifically, take my 104 course. So there's this weird bit of art here. I don't know if there was, I'm just going to go ahead and pull it up. I don't know what was going on with this. So it's mostly correct. So you've got Mexico, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas are, for Mexico. The rest of it for myself, because, of course, this is Germany. This is wrong. This is for Japan, question mark, for California. This is wrong, because Japan was, I wouldn't say directly allied with Britain in World War I, but they were working with Britain against Germany in the First World War. They were essentially tasked with protecting British assets in the Pacific, and told, hey, if you want to take German islands in the Pacific, you're more than welcome to. And they did. They took a lot of German islands in the Pacific during World War I. So this is not correct. I don't know what the artist was thinking when they did. This was like a post-World War II piece, and they got this part mixed up. I don't know what's going on here. But Japan was absolutely not allied with the Central Powers in World War I. So, just FYI, that is incorrect. Maybe they thought that Japan would turn on the Allies, since they weren't really part of the alliance. They were just sort of helping in the Pacific, and maybe they would turn. I don't know. So we have the Zimmerman note. I really like this one. Unfortunately, it's in French, so I don't actually know what the subtitle is saying. But you've got everything happening here. You've got the Lusitania sinking. You've got this angry ghost of Uncle Sam shaking his fist over the horizon. And while the Lusitania is still sinking, there aren't even people swimming out of it yet. Well, no, we do have a rowboat. You've got the Kaiser laughing maniacally, writing the Zimmerman note while his cape is flowing menacingly in the breeze. There's so much happening in this. It's so dramatic. In case you need to know what one of these battleships looked like back then, these are the battleships of World War I. Were really cool. They had these big smokestacks because they were not diesel powered, they were coal powered. So they were constantly putting out lots of smoke, big and heavy, and had these big old cannons and stuff. They weren't quite as impressive as the World War II battleships, of course, but they were big lumbering monsters. Here's the boys over in, well, not in the trenches at the moment, but getting ready to be in the trenches. Ah, yes. And then, of course, the mad brute of Germany and the culture. How dare, German culture, certainly not something that a lot of American culture is modeled after due to the vast amount of immigrants we have here, but, whatever. Here's no man's land. This is what parts of France look like after being bombed and shelled and shot through for 3 years. And there are actually parts of France today that you can't go to because it's too dangerous. There are regions in France where battles happened over 100 years ago now, where the water is poisoned due to all the chemicals, where there's still unexploded ordnance that just landed in the ground and didn't explode, but it still could explode. It's too dangerous due to a war that happened, 110 years ago now. So here's the guys getting what's assuredly nice, clean water out of a trench. So here we have the end of the war. Beaten Germany accepts armistice. Kaiser, Crown Prince, and Hindenburg seek refuge in Holland. Light down here, Holland's problem. All right. So the rest of the chapter is mostly this. It's really how America dealt with this war on the home front. And this will be seen in even greater degrees when we get to World War II, because obviously we were involved in World War II for much longer and much more completely. Like here, World War I, we sent some guys over to Europe. In World War II, like we are basically the entire Pacific front, and also we're in Europe for a lot of it as well. So like we are very stretched thin in World War II. World War I, it was still a major mobilization. So due to the amount of folks we were sending out, it required full mobilization at home. Women went to work to fill in the jobs that was left behind by men. Media was used to keep up morale. The progressive government and businesses were used to maintain control of these systems during the Great War. Wilson created the War Industries Board, supervised the purchase of military supplies to make sure that things were run efficiently. It didn't really work so well until March of 1918, when Wall Street financier Bernard Baruch took over. Basically, well, I'll just go ahead and go to the next one before we do that. Labor mobilized with the National War Labor Board, settle labor disputes, avoid strikes, attain an 8-hour workday, time and a half, labor's rights for collective bargaining, but weren't unable to achieve equal pay for equal work for women because, it's the 1918, or it's 1918, what are you going to do? More than 1 million women took up jobs normally seen as being for men because most men were, across the ocean getting shot at. So what a lot of this was attempting to keep these industries flowing as efficiently as possible. So like with the labor, rather than people going on strike, it was, hey, if you've got an issue, come together, list your grievances, we'll actually talk it out rather than ignoring you like most companies will, and try to get the problem fixed like right away rather than going on strike and halting production because we need to keep production going. So like the collective bargaining was what was wanted to begin with, but most corporations would just ignore them, and then striking was the way to make them listen. And this was just like, hey, let's avoid striking altogether and work things out. There are other agencies, regulated consumption and travel. Herbert Hoover, by the way, we're going to hear about Herbert Hoover a bunch in this and the next chapter. It seems like he was in charge of just about every agency in the government until he became president. And then he's like, well, I've done this now. I guess I'm done. Like, I've hit every federal agency we've got. So he started with the Food Administration. He wanted to increase the food supply with voluntary food conservation and children planting vegetable gardens. Essentially, if you plant your own vegetable garden, you don't have to go out and buy vegetables. Hoover felt this was, quote, just as real and patriotic an effort as the building of ships or the firing of cannon. Because, if you're conserving food, then the government can send more food overseas to the troops. And that's, you can't have soldiers fighting without food. Railroads were also regulated to ensure efficient troop and supply shipments, because you don't regulate the railroads and that's going to just be a mess. And if you want to try to use it for military purposes, you got to regulate the heck out of it. So this leads to a lot of this. So you've got war industry, needs water, protect production, use it wisely. So you got the Philadelphia Council of Defense. So, don't waste water. Water is used in all sorts of production. For example, in the aviation plant, I say I worked in, I was security guard there, but they use water for everything. A lot of it was like hydraulic stuff, but yeah, that plant used so much water. It wasn't a very big plant. So, I can imagine like massive heavy industries would use a lot of water. Help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. These are U.S. government bonds, which is essentially a loan to the government that you can sell back later for potentially a little bit of a profit. Don't waste paper. Paper is essential. A pound of paper wasted is a pound of fuel wasted. So, a lot of like conserving things, not wasting things. Again, buy bonds, keep them out of America. You got, the Germans looking like these subhuman monsters. On the job for victory, United States Shipping Board, Emergency Fleet Corporation. This is a big old pneumatic hammer this guy's got. Bless you. This one's World War II. You can tell from the tank in the that's almost a jet. The tank in the plane down here, that's not World War I. But same idea here. Labor and management working together rather than fighting. Fight or buy bonds. Bonds was a big thing. Here's U.S. Food Administration. This is the stuff that Hoover was working on. Food, buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local food, serve just enough, and use what is left. So, again, just don't waste. Save a loaf of wheat. So a lot of like saving wheat. Food will win the war. Wheat is needed for the Allies. Which was also part of the reason why that one sign was like prohibition is going to be good for the war, because if you're not making beer, you're not using as much wheat, because wheat, hops, that sort of thing is used in making beer, so that can instead be used to send to the troops to make bread. We eat because we work. Belong to the U.S. School Garden Army. I think we've got a concerning image coming up here in a minute. Here we go. Follow the Pied Piper. Join the U.S. School Garden Army. Who in here knows the story of the Pied Piper? It's not a good thing. Anybody else know the actual Pied Piper story? Not many of you? Okay, so the story goes, and this is one of the grim fairy tales, so that's a good way to get it started. There's a village infested with rats because it's 1500s Germany. What are you gonna do? And there's this guy that says he can lead the rats out of the village if the village pays him, because he's like an exterminator, exterminator's fee. And rather than killing them and making a mess, he has a pipe that he can play, and they'll all basically be hypnotized and follow him out of town. Depending on the telling, they'll either follow him into the woods and disperse, or follow him into a river and drown. And he succeeds in ridding the town of the rats. but then the village refuses to pay him because they're a bunch of cheap bastards. And so the next day, or that night, I should say, since he didn't get paid, he goes through the town, plays his pipe, and hypnotizes the children and pulls them out of the town. Again, depending on the telling, either lures them into the woods where they disappear or lures them into the river where they drown. Because the village decided to be a bunch of cheapos. Which is to say, don't follow the Pied Piper. Whoever made this piece doesn't know the actual story. Like, oh yeah, follow the Pied Piper. Like, no, you don't. That's like, oh, look at the van with get free candy sprayed on the side of it. Yeah, go get free candy, kids. Like, that's what this is. Yeah, so there's a later piece of propaganda that's like using the Pied Piper imagery correctly, but I found this and I had to include it because it's like, this is bad. All right. I always have to stop and tell that story for anybody that doesn't actually know about that, because that obviously, Grimm Fairy Tales is old, but whew. Now obviously, with all the years of let's be anti-war leading up to the war, once we did get involved in the war, there were still plenty of people who thought maybe we shouldn't be involved. So Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, headed by the Denver journalist George Creel, to create propaganda and inspire patriotic fervor. CPI encouraged reporters to censor their war coverage, create film reels to show the Allies as saviors of civilization, and the Central Powers as savage beasts. Boy, it feels like I'm playing Helldivers. Let's see. Yes, speaking of censoring war coverage, this was something we learned from Britain, because Britain made a boo-boo. There was a particularly there was a particularly big battle in World War I before we got involved, called the Battle of the Somme, where Britain decided that they were going to defeat the Germans with overwhelming force. So what they did was they were going to hit part of the German line with artillery for a week straight, just constant artillery barrage for 7 days without end. And then at the end of those 7 days, they'd set off a mine underneath the German line, because while the artillery was hitting, they dug underneath the battlefield and laid this huge mine. And then after the mine exploded, they jumped over the top of their trench and ran across the field, which they assumed all the Germans were going to be dead because, we hit them with artillery for 7 days. And they'd filmed the whole thing and sent it home as this great propaganda of how good our boys were. Well, the Germans were dug in deeper than they thought, and it was pretty obvious when the artillery stopped and the big bomb went off that something was about to happen. So the Germans popped up, got their machine guns, and as the British came running across no man's land, the Germans opened up. And it was all caught on film. And the British were like, well, we technically took 2 miles of land. So we'll send this home and show it to the public without editing any of it. And so they sent it home and showed it to public with literally the boys dying on film. And it caused a mass panic, and people were falling out of the theaters, and they realized real quick that they needed to be careful of what they sent back to the public. So the idea of censoring and editing the war coverage was made before we got involved. Still, though, the propaganda wasn't enough, so the Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed once again. These were, passed back in like the War of 1812, but these are new ones. So the Espionage Act prohibited anti-war activities, interfering with the draft, mailing publication, advocating forcible interference with any laws. And then the Sedition Act punished individuals who expressed beliefs disloyal or abusive to the American government, flag, or military uniform. Basically, you're like, hey, maybe we shouldn't go to war. That was technically against the law. Speaking out against the war brought many people to trial, including Eugene V. Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years, although pardoned after 3, because, the war was over within, like, a year, for saying the draft was a form of slavery. We'll actually get into his actual statement next chapter. American Protective League was formed during this time of anti-German prejudice. They worked with the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and employed a bunch of folks to spy on German residents suspected of being spies for the enemy. Basically, if you weren't fully assimilated into what was seen as the proper American culture, if you spoke a different language or partook in foreign customs, you were seen as being not true Americans. But this was not nearly as bad as what we would see in World War II with, hey, you look Japanese, we're going to pull you out of your home and put you in a concentration camp. This was, it wasn't great. It was like, hey, you're speaking something that's not English, or you are doing things that don't seem American enough. We're going to be real suspicious of you. Wasn't great, but it's still not as bad as, you look Japanese, we're going to pull you out of your home and put you in a concentration camp and sell your property while you're gone. So when we do let you out at the end of the war, you don't have anything. We'll talk more about that when we get to World War II. U.S. official war pictures. Imagine having to document like a war with one of these things. All right. The meat supplement, cottage cheese. Blech. 1 pound of cottage cheese applies more protein than beef and pork and lamb and veal and fowl, apparently. They don't just say chicken back then, I guess. Yeah, you send out a postcard and they'll bring you recipes for using this meat substitute. Ugh. I'm not a fan of cottage cheese. Oh, yeah, this one's in the book. It's slightly different in the book, but it's funny to me because, again, I've got that friend that was in the Navy, and I need to send this to him because he would find this very funny. Gee, I wish I were a man. I joined the Navy. The book actually has, instead of Navy Reserve or Coast Guard, be a man and do it, United States Navy Recruiting Station, rather than Navy Reserve or Coast Guard. Again, my Navy buddy, he would argue that you don't need to be a man to be in the Navy. And being in the Navy probably isn't the most manly of professions, or as he likes to put it, when you go in the Navy, 100 guys get on the boat and 50 couples come off. You get real close on the boat. Strike now, he's fighting for you. Buy Liberty Bonds so you can stab a German. Pledge allegiance, silence about the war. Again, this was important during the war. Now, granted, the Sedition and Espionage Acts continue after the war, which we'll get into next chapter. But the idea was basically like, if a soldier is riding back home to his family and maybe says too much, like, oh yeah, we're going to be in such and such, or, our ships are bringing us wherever. That shouldn't have ever made it home. That should have been intercepted by, the military, and they should have edited that, or the soldiers should have known better. But if that makes it home, you're not supposed to tell anybody that you now know that. You're supposed to keep quiet, because if you tell somebody and that gets spread around, somebody that doesn't need to know that might find out, and that word might get back to someone who can actually cause harm. Now, this is obviously not World War I. This is, Vietnam, but resist the draft, don't register. We haven't really had a draft issue lately, but there has been some rumbling about, not as many people are signing up for the military anymore. Because what do you know? People are just realizing that maybe going and dying isn't maybe the best move. Sedition bills, I had this last semester. Free speech, free press, honest opinion, getting consumed. Too drastic sedition legislation. Now this is more about after the war, because a lot of it was used to clamp down on the concern of communism in America. And as you can see, it's a little bit drastic for what was not really a big problem. 200,000 U.S. secret agents cover the nation. Thanks for letting us know, newspaper. Government marshals round up pro-Germans. Again, I mentioned this to my other class, but all right, let's say let's pretend we're the German Empire's intelligence agency, right? And we want to send spies to America to get information. Would we be sending people who can't speak English? That doesn't seem like the best bet. Let's send people to America that can only speak German. They won't stand out. They'll be real efficient in getting information for us. This is basically saying, that if you go on strike, you're helping the Kaiser. Oh, okay. This was just me looking for fun propaganda images, and this was a long time ago now. It's Team Fortress 2. Soldiers eat babies, that's a fact. Think of the children. Join Team Demoman today. Basically, Team Fortress 2 was doing a Demoman versus soldier thing, and they were like, hey, make us some fun propaganda, and some people made some fun propaganda, and this was probably my favorite one. So I'm using this one. Because this was the kind of stuff that you would see during World War I and World War II. It's like, oh, the Germans are eating babies. It's like, really? That's what we're going with? All right. The next bit's about the League of Nations, and there's a lot to that. So I'll see y'all next week. Also, I'm going to